snowing, it's raining.
I heard it's supposed to snow again on Thursday.
Yeah. We had 2 nice days. Ready?
Yeah.
Okay, so we're about to embark on Jewish history and 5-part series. And why do we do history? So there's a famous adage that those who do not study history are doomed to repeat it. So there's a lot we can learn from Jewish history. But as Jewish history, there's another dimension to it. Rabbi Jonathan Sachs uses this analogy. He said, imagine you're in front of a bookcase, right? And there's many different books. And each book is a story. He says that there's one book on that bookcase that has your name on it. And that is our story. And it's a story going back, starting with the beginning of our people, starting with our ancestors. And then the last pages of the book are not yet written. But in order to write the last pages of the book, of course, you need to read the beginning of the book. So in a sense, by studying Jewish history, we are reading the beginning of our story, and then so we can continue the story, which is one that started many years ago. So we're going to go through Jewish history, and there's a few things we want to accomplish. We want to look at the story of the Jewish people and how we evolved as a nation, and what are the themes of what it means, Jewish peoplehood, and how we became who we are. Then we're also going to look at history in terms of how do we know the events came true, especially tonight, in terms of fact-checking the Bible, right? How do we know the Exodus happened? And thirdly, we're going to look at different places Jews have gone in our wanderings, and how we were impacted by those places and how we impacted them. So these are some of the things we're going to set out to do. Now, in terms of the story, saga of Jewish history, there's also what we're going to see is, of course, the unique role that Jews have played in the history of the world. And John Adams, the second president of the United States, this is what he said over 200 years ago. The Hebrews have done more to civilize men than any other nation. If I were an atheist and believed in blind eternal fate, I would still believe that fate had ordained the Jews to be the most essential instrument for civilizing the nations. In other words, he's recognizing the unique role he played, and how also, in other words, this role is almost one that we were made for, so to speak. And so today, in terms of what we're going to try and accomplish, we're going to look at the patriarchs, the original iconoclasts, right? Idol breakers. We're going to look at the Exodus, which really sets the vision and direction of us as a nation. And then we're going to begin talking about the Jewish people entering the land of Israel. So that's what we're on for. Now, if we talk about the beginning of Jewish history, where do we begin?
Adam and Eve.
Adam and Eve, okay, that's one possibility. That's where the Torah begins. Anyone else?
The Exodus.
The Exodus, that's where we began as a nation. But how did our nation come about? Abraham and Sarah. So all three are right. The story of the Torah goes back to Adam and Eve. However, they were not specific. That's the story of the history of humanity. The Exodus is the beginning of our nationhood. But really, Abraham, the story of the saga of Abraham and Sarah were known as Hebrews. They weren't Jews yet. The story of the Hebrews begins with Abraham and Sarah. Now, one of the things we're going to try and do is look at words to understand concepts. So what does Hebrew mean? Ivri. Anyone? So the rabbis tell us that the word Ivri comes from Ever, from the bank, and it means that Abraham was from the other side of the river, the other bank, in other words. Or it is from the word lavor, to pass over. But the message of what Abraham was is that he was different. Right? That's the implication. Where did Abraham come from? Where did he live? Where's the opening scene? So a number of years ago, the Pope went to visit ancient Iraq and to visit the birthplace of Abraham. So Abraham lived in Mesopotamia. So when he came from the other side of the river, which river is that?
Euphrates.
The Tigris and the Euphrates, very good. Which is what was known as the cradle of civilization, right? That's where humanity started. If you look at the map here, the second page, top map, you see Babylon or Chaldea, right? And on the right would be Iran, and the left would be Iraq. You see Israel here, you see kind of orient the map. This is the Mediterranean, Turkey, Syria, Iraq, over here. You know, Middle East, I guess we should have superimposed a modern map upon it. So Abraham passed over the river, but already when he was in Ur, which is where he was from, or where he was living, he already was different. The famous story of Abraham as a child, and as I tell it, you might have the images of the story of George Washington, cherry tree, except this has a different spin. Abraham's father, they say, was owned an idol shop. This is in the Midrash, in the rabbinic teachings. He owned an idol store. And one day he had to go somewhere, so he leaves little Avramala watching the store. Avramala, you take care, I'll be back, you know, make sure you do a good job. So his father comes back, and he opens up the door, and he walks in, and he sees smashed, shattered, on the floor, everything's a mess, all broken. He said, Avram, what happened? I told you to watch the store. He said, I didn't do anything, so what happened? He said, he did it. And one statue was still standing with a hammer in his hand. And his father said, he did it, don't be silly, those things can't do anything. And that was kind of the point he was trying to make. And so it said, Maimonides talks about this, that Avram started questioning God, questioning the world, in reality, when he was 3 years old. And if you think that seems improbable, the most amazing things can come out of the mouth of a 3-year-old. Our 8-year-old wrote me a series of questions. And how do we know the Torah is true and not a myth? M-I-T-H. So Avram at 3 years old started to question, what is the world? How did it get here? What's it doing here? How does it work? Why does it work? And it said that he was on this journey, and he was a truth seeker. And when he finally arrived at the age of 40, he came to the unwavering conclusion that there is a God, and there's only one God, and that God is a God of righteousness and justice and morality, and that his role was not just to follow God, but to bring God's message to the world. So that's how Avram began. But the Torah doesn't really talk about any of this. It's very interesting. What is the opening scene of Abraham in the Torah? No. When God tells Abraham to leave everything he knew and to go on a journey. So that's our opening scene, which is his journey to go to the land of Israel. The beginning of his geographic journey. Now, why doesn't the Torah give us all the background? So, Nachmanides, one of the great medieval commentaries, say, the Torah didn't want to be involved in Abraham pulling himself out of all of the negativity and the false belief. I want it to start with him going towards a positive true belief. That's what it says. So Abraham does this journey. He goes to the land of Israel. And that was his quest. Now, how do we have these different periods of Jewish history, right? Abraham was a Hebrew. That's the beginning of the story. And then you get to the Jewish people. What is the difference between the Abraham being a Hebrew and the Israelites being a people? So what distinguishes Abraham's relationship to God, and eventually the Jewish people's relationship to God, is what we call a covenant. The relationship to God is not just a relationship of love. It's not just a relationship of a belief. In fact, the Torah doesn't, well, at this point it doesn't emphasize those two. Although it does tell us later that God loves the patriarchs, loves us as a people. And we are supposed to love God. But what it emphasizes is the relationship of a covenant. What is a covenant? Covenant is a two-way agreement. In other words, we enter into a pact, and each person in the pact has responsibilities to the other. And Abraham's responsibility is to follow God's ways of righteousness, and God's promise is that Abraham and his descendants will be his people, right? Will have a special relationship with the Almighty, and also then he'll promise that he will have children, and that this relationship will be tied up in the land of Israel. Okay? So it's a covenantal relationship until the giving of the Torah at Mount Sinai and the national covenant with God. It was an individual covenant. So Abraham had his own covenant. Each of his children had their own individual covenant. The others, it says that Abraham, before he left Babylonia, took with him the souls he had made in Haran, in this place. So there are other individuals who were drawn to Abraham and followed him, and they also each had this special covenant, this relationship with God. But it wasn't yet on a communal level, it was on an individual level. So when Abraham sets out, God makes an incredible promise. He says, the ones who bless you will be blessed, the ones who curse you will be cursed. And he says, through you will be blessed all of the families of the earth. Now, that's a pretty amazing promise to make, right? You will be the source of blessing for the entire world. The world's a big place. So what's so amazing about this is if you think about it. And so at this time, now what's also amazing is that Abraham, I mean, if you are in the business of trying to impact people and get your message out, where do you want to be? Peoria, Illinois, or Manhattan, New York?
New York.
You want to be in New York, right? That's where the action is. So Abraham was told to leave Babylon, where there were so many people, and to go to the land of Canaan, which really was kind of like a backwater, right? And it says Abraham was tested with 10 tests. That in itself is an enormous test, right? To leave everything you know, and then to leave where all your people are, go to a place where they're not going to be there. So some backwater, some, not very well known nomadic head of a family in some backwater country. God is saying this preposterous promise that all the families of the earth will be blessed through you. So here we are, 3,900 years later, and if you think about it, 2.5 billion people in this world believe in this message of Abraham, right? Count the monotheistic faiths. Christianity and Islam came out of the Torah. Christianity believes that God gave the Torah on Mount Sinai. The Quran is a rewriting of the story, but basically traces itself back to Abraham. So 2.5 to 3 billion people follow Abraham's message and are inspired by it. So we only have another 3 billion to go, but just that alone is a powerful testimony to the Torah itself as a document which sets down the future which we see unfolded. So that's a pretty powerful testimony to Abraham and who he was and to what the Torah is. Okay, now the beginning of the family. So Abraham makes his way to the land of Canaan, which was called at the time, it wasn't yet the land of Israel. And he and Sarah finally have the child that God promised them. Isaac is born. First, they can't have a child, so he has a child through Hagar, his servant, Ishmael, and then Isaac is born. And then Isaac has two twins, Jacob and Esau. And what we're going to see what's peculiar and interesting about the matriarchal family is that each generation, the younger child will be promoted above the older one. Ishmael over Yitzchak, Jacob, Yaakov over Esau, and then in a sense Joseph over his other brothers. And it'll cause a lot of tension and conflict. But ultimately we see that kind of the vindication that the younger one was the one who had the qualities to carry on this family mission and Abraham's vision. And really there's a message, a powerful message is what we call meritocracy. In other words, the older son did not just inherit the family leadership if the younger one was more qualified, had more of the qualities which were needed to carry on the family message. So that's what we see in the early history of this family. So we have these Hebrews, and then we get to Jacob. And Jacob has 12 sons, and Jacob had a very difficult life. He wasn't the Abraham fought battles, impacted other tribes and nations. Isaac was a mystical figure, and Jacob was not specifically one or the other. In a sense, he was a merging of the two. And he is the one that, when he struggles with an angel, his name is changed to Israel. And that's the name of the nation. The nation we call Bnei Israel, the children of Israel, sons of Israel, through the 12 sons and the 12 tribes. So what does Yisrael mean? Hebrew means from the other side of the bank. What does Yisrael mean? Israel. Anyone? Yeah?
Struggles with God. So
when he's renamed is, very good one, is the scene where he is at night wrestling with a man, who it appears is actually not just a man, but an angel. And he comes out injured, but prevailing. And it says, for you have struggled with men and gods and prevailed. And so on one level, to be an Israelite means to struggle with God. That's part of our relationship with God, right? It also means Sar, Kel, which is Prince of God, which implies carrying this banner representing God. It also means Yashar, Kel, to be straight before God, which drives home that message of Abraham's righteousness and justice. So that's Jacob will be the beginning of this nation, and also the beginning of the next period of Jewish history. So we're going to go from the patriarchs, if you look at your timeline in front, 1700 BCE, to the Hebrews in Egypt. So there's a famine in the land. Jacob's sons go down to get grain. I'm not going to go through the whole story of Genesis. The other brothers, Joseph was already down there because his brothers had sold him off to be a slave. And the brothers' families reunited. And Joseph says, why don't you move down here during the famine so I can help provide for you? Why do you think God sent me down here but to provide for you? And one of the themes that Joseph emphasizes, and we're going to see, is kind of what we call divine providence, is the God's hand directing the events of the unfolding of Jewish history. So they were meant to be in Egypt, even though we're going to see it turns back, right? So how long were the Jews in Egypt?
80 years.
Excuse me?
80 years.
So 80 years was how long slavery lasted. Some people say it lasted 110 years, but they're actually in Egypt 210 years. Now there is a question in the Torah. The Torah says you will be strangers in a land that is not yours for 400 years, and then you will be oppressed. Abraham was already foretold that. So the understanding is that from the birth of Isaac, even though Isaac was in Israel, we didn't have control over Israel. So the birth of Isaac to the Exodus was 400 years. In Egypt, there are actually 210 years, and the slavery didn't begin at first. It began only later. Now, let's talk a little about fact-checking the Bible. Okay. So how do we know these things were historically accurate? Okay. So how many of us think the 10 Commandments existed? 10 Commandments, right? Yes? Well, pretty much. So the first commandment says, I am the Lord your God who took you out of Egypt. So the 10 Commandments existed, then the Exodus existed. So the question is, what historical evidence do we have for these events? Now, when we start talking about the patriarchs at first, okay, it's going to be challenging. Now, people sometimes view history as science. Like, something happened, I should be able to prove it, right? And here's where we have to distinguish between archaeology and history, right? Archaeology is, in a sense, a science, right? It's digging into the earth, finding objects, and trying to identify those objects. But you have these physical, tangible objects, which give you evidence of something. Question is, evidence of what? And this is where, in a sense, history is connecting the dots between the evidence we have from history. And that is not always a science, right? It could be theory, it could be speculation. There's a lot of kind of filling in the gaps. And so we can use deduction, but in a sense it's like a pointless painting. You know, the painters painted with dots, right? You've got all these dots. The question is, will these dots form a picture, and what is the picture representing? So that's going to be our challenge. Now for the patriarchs and matriarchs, we have a particular challenge. First of all, obviously they were much smaller. I mean, by the time you get Jews leave Egypt, you're talking about millions of people. Here you're talking about one family, right? Second of all, they were Bedouins, so they were constantly traveling around. They didn't keep records. There's no archaeological records. Third of all, we said they're very small in number. So we're not actually going to, there was once a rumor, and I don't know if it ever substantiated, that there was a certain tablet they found in Lebanon or Syria, the Syrians have it, that talked about Abraham. Never seen any kind of substantiation of it. But as far as we know, we don't have any first-hand external historical correlation to the patriarchs, except for the Torah itself, of course. But what we do have is the context, the background in which they lived. So when they did excavations in Iraq, in a place called Nuri, near Kirkuk, which during the Iran war, the storm, this area now is all kind of like in a quagmire of ISIS, but for a while the name was one of the major oil centers. They found excavations, and a lot of which is being destroyed by ISIS. You know this, they're destroying historical artifacts and archaeology. But what they found on these tablets, which came from are names that are found in the Bible as well. For instance, Haran, Abraham's brother, and Nahor are names which have been found in that context of ancient Mesopotamia. So the names being used, the context, the background, is already there. Even the word Ur, where he was from, they found. The names Terah, Sarah, Milcah, Laban, all reflect a connection to the sun, moon god, Sin. And Laban, his uncle's name, actually got Abraham's nephew, means white. So a lot of the background can be correlated. There was actually a big debate in historical literature because it says that Abraham sent his servants to travel by camel to go from ancient Israel back to Syria. It was halfway along their journey, the town of Haran up here, and they traveled by camel. There was a big debate about whether there were camels around the 1800s BCE, and some people argued that there weren't. Therefore, you see, these stories don't come from that period. So apparently, horses were used, donkeys were used most commonly as pack animals. But when Abraham sent his servants, he had to impress the future in-laws. So apparently, others argue that camels were in fact used as a ceremonious animal. And that's why it makes sense that his servant traveled on a camel. So these are the kind of things which are debated in the historical record, historical literature. So now let's come to the Jews in Egypt. Because here you would expect to find much more evidence, right? You're not talking about one family, you're talking about people that grew when they came from 70 souls to millions of people, right? Exponential growth in a few hundred years. And Egyptian culture obviously has many records and artifacts, okay, that we know. You have Joseph, who was supposed to have ruled over Egypt, right? And what's also curious is that the Bible itself does not give us details. It doesn't even tell us the name of the Pharaoh. It just calls him Pharaoh. So who is the Pharaoh of the Exodus? This is something as well which is brought up in the question that people are curious about. So, so what evidence do we have? By the way, any questions? Oh, good. What evidence do we have? So in Exodus 1:10, when the Egyptians start turning on the Israelites and not being so favorable to them being there, what do they say? What does Pharaoh say? That these Hebrews, they're multiplying, there's so many of them, they're all over the place, and if we are attacked, they will rise us and kick us out of the land. In other words, they were afraid of the Jews. And by the way, what's amazing about, unfortunately, the beginning of Exodus is that you see this kind of model of anti-Semitism. The Jews are too many. They're a fifth column. They're not loyal. They're going to turn against us. And then you see a gradual, step-by-step persecution of Jews. And this is really a model of anti-Semitism, which unfortunately has repeated itself over and over and over. Jews are outsiders, Jews are different, they're all over the place, they're taking over, and then, turning on us. So, that's an interesting historical aside that you see in the beginning of the book of Exodus. But this accusation that they will join the enemies and fight against us. So in fact, around this period, around the 1500s BCE, before the Common Era, you had invasions of northern tribes coming into Egypt. They called them the Hyksos invasions. And so the migration from the north, which might have well been because of the famine that the Bible described is correlated in historical sources. That's the first point. Okay. The second one is, very interesting, that there is a description, this is from a papyrus, 1250 BCE in Egypt. It says, distribute grain rations to the soldiers and the Habiru, who carry stones to the great pylon of the great city of Ramses. What does Habiru sound like? Hebrew. It does. And the Jews carrying the great pylons to the great city of Ramses. So I'm sorry to disappoint you, but despite the little pictures in your childhood Haggadahs, the Jews did not build the pyramids in Egypt. The pyramids were built about 1,000 years before we ever got there. That's how ancient Egypt is. But we did, the Torah tells us in Exodus 1:11, the Israelites built the cities of Pitom and Ramses. Exactly paralleling this papyrus which was found. And if you go, it's even more powerful. I took the kids once to the Metropolitan Museum, 6 blocks away from here. You turn right, you walk into the ancient Egypt section, and there's a beautiful temple of Dendur. But you go into one of the side rooms on the left, and they have the mosaics, not the mosaics, the painted on the walls, what's it called? Wall paintings is the name for it. There is the paintings of the scenes of slaves working in the fields and working on projects, and those slaves had a darker colored skin, interestingly enough. Ethnically, they were different from the Egyptians, which leads us to believe that they might have been a more Semitic tribe coming in from the north. Okay. Number of years ago.
Wouldn't the Egyptians also have been dark skin?
So just raising that. There was a whole thing like 20 years ago. The Egyptians really were Africans, and they looked, African, Negro with dark skin. Big debate over this. So the Upper Nile, which is southern Egypt, had the Nubian kingdom. And the Nubians were Africans, but the Egyptians, it appears, were not. The Egyptians were different ethnic, and in the end period of the Egyptian Empire, like in the years 700, 600, 500 BCE, when the Egyptian Empire was kind of going into a downward spiral, they called on the Nubians, who had always been their rival, or they had ruled over them. They kind of called on them to come and rule over Egypt to help protect them. So in that period they might have been, but earlier it appears probably not. I mean, just from the wall paintings, you see that frescoes. That's the word for wall paintings.
They would also they probably just spent more time in the sun, which is why.
So that's the other question of whether the slaves had spent more time in the sun and the people who weren't were more. That's another possibility as well. So that's kind of like one of the sources, the Habiru, working on the city of Ramses. The most powerful testimony to the dating of the Israelites going back to this period is from a stone called the Merneptah stela. Merneptah stela is it's written in somewhat in pictograms. I don't know if it's exactly cuneiform, but often they would record their victories. And now part of this question is that we have to recognize this, that the dating of these events and the historical verification of them makes a big difference. It's a very loaded issue, because if you say that there's no historical verification, and then it opens up the possibility to say, well, this book wasn't written when it said it was. It was written at a later period, and it's fabricated, right? I mean, we've all heard these theories that really there was no Exodus, The Israelites just kind of emerged from local Canaanite populations and then wrote this myth about how they became a nation. This is the theory which was pushed for a while, and it came out of more universities and what we call higher biblical criticism, right? Until they found the Merneptah stela. And the Merneptah stela dates from the 12th century BCE, so you're talking about the 1100s. And on it, it talks about the Egyptian campaign to the north. It says, Canaan is plundered with every evil. Ashkelon is carried off. Gezer is seized. Yanoam is made that which does not exist. And Israel is laid waste. So we see that in the 1200s BCE, there's a text which verifies the existence of Israel. Now this would have been after the Exodus, but we see that it dates back at least to that period. Yeah.
I volunteered on Kibbutz Suba outside of Jerusalem in Mevaseret, and all around the kibbutz we have a lot of ruins, and they showed us like there was an Egyptian town there at one point, and maybe it had been resettled.
Like an outpost.
Yeah. Just interesting.
So here you see that they did forays into,
It's cool. Did they know like how far back it dated?
I don't remember, but it
I
was.
wonder if they studied that.
Suba is like right outside of Mevaseret in the Judean hills.
outskirts of Jerusalem, yeah.
Yeah.
So that's an older text, but then the question begs itself is, well, if you had this enormous exodus, why don't we have a testimony to the events of the exodus? I mean, the 10 plagues, the splitting of the Red Sea, the Egyptian empire crumbling. So that's a question that's raised. So turn now to the fourth page of your handouts. So this is another archaeological source, which is called the Pure Papyrus. You can go online, you can get the full text of this papyrus. But look at this selection of text from it. Look what it says. Plague is throughout the land. Blood is everywhere. The river is blood. That is our water. That is our happiness. What shall we do in respect of it? All is in ruin. Then trees are destroyed. No fruit or herbs are found. Forsooth, grain has perished on every side. What does that sound like?
10 plagues.
What was one of the plagues? The locusts ate up all the food. What does the first two lines sound like?
Blood in the river.
Blood, the plague of blood in the water. The next one, the land is not light. Which one is that? Plague of darkness. The Nile overflows, yet no one plows it. No craftsmen work. The enemies of the land have spoiled its crafts. And gold and lapis lazuli, silver and malachite, carnelian and bronze are fastened on the necks of female slaves. What does it say when the Jewish people left? How did they go? They got from the Egyptians all of these precious metals and gold and silver and other precious objects. So, you'll ask me, why didn't I ever hear about this before? This seems to be incontrovertible evidence for the Exodus. Yes? You've never heard of this? No? Have you ever heard people say, well, why isn't there evidence for the Exodus? Yeah. So, to give you the full explanation, it gets a little technical, and it has to do with dating. The problem with this papyrus is that it dates from about the year 1550 BCE. Ramses was in the 1200s BCE. So they will say, well, this is too early. Can't be. Must have been talking about something else. So the question is, when did the Exodus happen? And you'd think it would be obvious. And if you look at the traditional dating of it, it's much earlier. So who was the pharaoh of the Exodus? Anyone? Who was it?
Ramses. Ramses.
Ramses. How do we know?
I remember watching a movie based on it, so.
The movie, Cecil B. DeMille said it. Okay. By the way, don't mock it. More, I think American Jews know the story of the Exodus from Cecil B. DeMille than they do from the original, you know. I read the book, I'll just wait for the movie to come out. So, but if that's the way to learn it, it's okay. Only problem is he didn't follow exactly the biblical text, so you gotta know when he deviates from the true story, but overall he captures the spirit of it. So, why didn't we ever hear about this? So how do we know who is the Pharaoh of the Exodus? The fact is that the Torah does not tell us. It never tells us his name, as I mentioned before. It tells us the Jews built the store cities of Pitom and Ramses. But I'll ask you this. How do you know, why do you assume that the city of Ramses was named after the Pharaoh? Maybe the Pharaoh was named after the city. Maybe Pharaoh came from Ramses, and that's why it was called Ramses. And the Pharaoh of the Exodus was not Ramses necessarily. So, when you look at the dating of ancient history, of Egyptian history, do you want to hear the technical side of it? Yes,
Yeah.
no, yes, okay. So, how do we know the dating of ancient Egypt? So we have, we talked before about archaeology, finding hieroglyphics. We do have hieroglyphics of kings and their children, We have certain lists of kings from different periods. Now, Egyptian history, once again, you're talking about from 3000 BCE to the turn of the millennium. You're talking about some 3,000 years. And where do we have the definitive history of how that whole timeline comes from? So we have that from Manetho. Manetho was the definitive Egyptian historian who lived in the year 100. But the problem is that even Manetho only had blocks of different kings to work from. He speculated on how to put those blocks of kings lists together. And we don't know what he was basing himself on, because he lived hundreds, sometimes thousands of years after these descriptions. So there are attempts to correlate certain astrological phenomena with, that I guess astrologers know happened, with the accounts of these phenomena in Egyptian sources. That's another way to kind of say, well, I have a block of 800 years of kings, but where do I place that block? So these are some of the debates that go on about, we don't have archaeological evidence of listing every king and the whole line and be able to trace the whole thing back accurately. The ironic part is that the secular historians rely upon Manetho to date those blocks of kings, to put it all in context. If they're relying upon him as an accurate historical source for that, then I ask you, why don't they rely upon him as an accurate historical source for the Exodus? Because Manetho talks about the Exodus of the Hebrews from Egypt. Granted, it's over 1,000 years later, but he has it as part of Egyptian history. Some people say, well, why don't we have an account of it? We do. It's from 1,000 years later. Yeah, but people rely upon Manetho for lots of other things. So all of a sudden, conveniently, they'll rely upon him to place the timelines of kings, but then they don't want to rely upon him for the Exodus. So this is kind of like, the question on the historical canon and the questions over this. So the point of trying to make is there is historical evidence for pieces of this. How you connect the lines, okay, that's a question you can ask. But there's more evidence than what you usually read about in the classic history textbooks. And I would even stick my neck out to say that academia has an inherent bias against the Torah and against religiosity. And so sometimes there's an agenda. So that is kind of the broad strokes of some of the historical evidence and some of the historical issues around it. Now, now we get to the next chapter, the Exodus, and then we'll come back to the fact-checking. So the story of Moses himself is a fascinating story, because if you think about, how this story unfolded, here is the person who becomes the leader of the Jewish people, was born Jewish, and yet is raised as an outsider, is raised as an Egyptian. It's fascinating, transition or flipping from an Egyptian prince to the leader of the Jewish people, right? We're probably familiar with the famous story. He was put in a basket, discovered by the daughter of Pharaoh, put in the basket because the Jews were being persecuted and the Jewish boys were being thrown into the river. Found by the daughter of Pharaoh, raised in the palace, goes out as a young man. You imagine him at 18, 20, when people start to become more self-aware and try and find their identity. So it says he went out to his brothers. So the Torah it appears he knew he was born Hebrew and was curious about it. So he goes out, he sees a Jew being hit by an Egyptian, kills the Egyptian, and he flees. And he flees for decades and decades, and then goes to Midian, which is really somewhere in the Sinai Peninsula, has the vision of the burning bush, and is sent back into Egypt. But we don't know much about him. We don't know how he merited to have God's vision. We don't know how he became the greatest prophet ever. But we do know that God sent him as the messenger, which makes sense because, the whole idea of slave mentality, right? You can take the Jew out of Egypt, but can't you take Egypt out of the Jew? So it makes sense that he, as an outsider, was able to lead the people because he wasn't kind of burdened by this slave mentality or slave baggage. And goes back into Egypt. The story of the 10 plagues unfolds, which we're approaching Passover. We kind of think of the 10 plagues as, boom, 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 boom. The chronology of the 10 plagues was each plague lasted a week. Then there would be a 3-week hiatus, and another plague would come on. So that the timeline here is that really the plagues took 10 months to unfold, which puts it in a very different perspective. Now, can you bring me some seltzer, please?
Sorry?
Can you bring me some seltzer or water, please?
Of course.
So, the Hebrews are taken out of Egypt. They start traveling through the desert, and they come to Mount Sinai. So everyone wants to know, where is Mount Sinai? And there is a deep message here, which is that, on some level, from a Jewish point of view, we're not supposed to necessarily know where Mount Sinai is. It doesn't matter where it is. In fact, the whole point of Mount Sinai is that the Torah was given outside of the land of Israel to show us that we are not dependent upon any geographical place as Jews. Yes, we have a homeland. Yes, we yearn for it and strive to be there. But if you're not there, the Torah is universal. So that's one message of Mount Sinai. Now, we talked before about different stages of the evolution of this Abraham's vision, and Mount Sinai is where we went from having a personal, individual covenant with the Almighty to a national covenant, right? To a national mission as a Jewish people, and that's a radical shift because it's no longer okay. I have my relationship to God. I navigate it. I am my own individual, but there's a national responsibility and national participation as well. And part of the juxtaposition of the slavery, the exodus, and then the nationhood is purposeful. The irony is that, the larger question is, why do the Jews have to go through this period of slavery? Abraham was already told that they would go through it, they were meant to go through it. And what we see clearly is that on the eve of nationhood and self-empowerment, the Jewish people had a period of disempowerment. And that's a powerful message for a nation. It's constitutory iterates, be kind to the stranger, for you are strangers in the land which was not yours. Right? And it's also a message that now you are free and you are empowered, but remember those who are disempowered. The book of Deuteronomy calls Egypt, the slave in Egypt, the smelting furnace. What is a smelting furnace? It's when the temperature, you take raw earth, raw materials, you raise the temperature so high that all of the imperfections fall out, and you're left with pure silver or pure gold. So we view that that period was a period of evolution for the Jewish people, a period of learning, a period of embodying certain qualities. And through the oppression came about maturity as a people. Now, let's get back to our question, right? And by the way, the founding fathers of the United States saw the same narrative, a period, a theme of nationhood, which was achieved through redemption from oppression, right? The Puritans being oppressed in England, fleeing to Holland, going through the sea, and they self-consciously viewed their voyage across the Atlantic like the splitting of the Red Sea. The voyage through the sea to get to the promised land. And Benjamin Franklin proposed that the emblem of the new nation of the United States should be what? Moses leading the children of Israel through the split sea. There's a very clear self-awareness of that.
But it was outvoted.
It was voted for the eagle. Right? So Mount Sinai is a seminal event where, in a sense, we declare our independence, and where our Constitution is set up, right? The Torah is, in a sense, our Constitution. And what is pointed out is that there were law codes before the Torah. The most famous one is the Hammurabi Code of ancient Babylon, where there were laws, property laws, and laws that set about an orderly society. But the Torah as a law document is unique. Why? So first of all, it integrates a moral values into the legal system. It's not just let's have laws in society function. It's let's have laws which reflect a greater ethical striving and inculcate that into the people. So there are 5 areas where the Torah, some of you have heard me talk about this before, since introduced radical new ideas which today we take for granted as part of Western civilization. The absolute value of human life. Built upon values of justice and equality for all. A moral foundation, ethical monotheism, upon which those values are predicated. The values of brotherhood of man and universal peace. And the importance of education and ongoing education. The Torah, which were radical ideas at the time. For us, we're not aware of that because they've become such a parcel of Western civilization. So, that's something to think about. So back to our question. Where is Mount Sinai? Anyone? Is it or we to take whole Sunday? Lauren, any thoughts on this?
It doesn't matter where it is.
Well, that's what I said before. But, you know, just like the Raiders of the Lost Ark, everyone's where's the Ark of the Covenant? You know, there's the historian, was it called Naked Archaeologist? Anyone ever seen that? He's on A&E or one of these Simcha shows. He's a Dutch Jew, does this interesting documentary. He has a whole theory about the 10 plagues, right? Whether they weren't the result of, the kind of attempts to explain the plagues on a naturalistic level. So his theory, one of his theories is that right around that time you had the explosion of the volcano on Santorini, and the Mycenaean Empire, which was an early Greek civilization, was wiped out. And by the way, this is more like the 1500s BCE. This would also correlate the earlier dating of the Exodus. So the theory would go that the plague of darkness was obviously the volcano. The water was really, when you have earthquakes, sometimes iron gases are released, and when iron goes into water, it turns the water red. And then it would have led to swarms of locusts, wild animals running around, and even the wiping out of the Egyptian army in the sea would have been a tsunami provoked by the volcano. Now, the thing to say about all these theories is that even if you want to rely upon such a theory, the question is, why would the tsunami have struck right when the Jews came out of the ocean and the Egyptians were in it, right? So even there, the timing would would lead to the possibility of a divine timing. So you're right, I don't explain, but just to indulge. So there is a mountain in southern Sinai. And here's the map of the journeys of the Jewish people. Yeah.
How would you explain the death of firstborns?
Oh, he even has an explanation for that. So when poisonous gases are death of the firstborn, apparently, we view that a person of prominence would be on a higher level. But apparently the firstborn were privileged in ancient Egypt, were allowed to sleep on the floor. The lower bed being more privileged. And so his theory was that the gases that were released by the volcano also might have contained poisonous gases. And gases are heavy and fall to the floor. So the firstborn would have been poisoned because they're sleeping lower than everyone else.
Is that like scientifically
I don't know. It's a theory among others. But as I said before, sometimes you have the dots, and drawing the dots, what I'm hoping to show is there are enough dots here to give us a correlation. Absolute proof? No, we don't have it. But there is evidence, more evidence than the academic community would let on. So here you have your map of the Sinai Peninsula. Where's Mount Sinai? Kind of at the bottom, right? So, and if you go to Sinai today, there is a St. Catherine's Monastery at the base of the mountain. Is that where it is? You're right, we don't really know. Some of the other theories, though, are fascinating. The joke used to be that, all the oil is in the Arabian Peninsula and Israel has no oil. So the joke used to be if Moses had only turned right instead of turning left when we left Egypt, if he'd only turned right, where would he have wound up? Saudi Arabia. Today, of course, they found major natural gas deposits off the Mediterranean in Israel, so Israel has 20 years of energy supplies and enough to export as well. So that narrative has been there is a theory. There are a couple of journalists who they along the naturalistic explanation. If you look at the description in the Torah of the giving of the Torah, right? Clouds on the mountain, thunder and lightning, shaking. What does it sound like? Cloud on the mountain? Come on, guys.
That's,
Volcano. So they say, where are there active volcanoes? Saudi Arabia. So they went around to try and snoop around some of those mountains. And they said the Saudis had it very securely closed off with fences. And when they climbed or broke fences, they started to find biblical artifacts and were found and then skirted out of there. So their theory is that Mount Sinai was a volcano and it's in Saudi Arabia. There's another professor. What's his name? I don't remember his name. He is a Jewish Italian archaeologist that discovered in the southern Negev desert, right, so south of Israel, but a little north of the Sinai Peninsula, these mountains. And on those mountains he found rock paintings. Two of the rock paintings were two boxes with 5 lines in each box. What does that sound like? Sounds like clouds. And another one was of a staff and a curly line, which would have been Moses' staff and the snake. So his speculation is that Mount Sinai is somewhere in the southern Negev desert. Now it could have been that the Jews passing through there did these paintings. I don't know why he believed that that's where the events themselves would have to have taken place, which leads to another question. If you have 2 million, or at least 2 million people traveling through a desert, where is the evidence of their travels? So here we come back to the same explanation as the patriarchs. The Jews in the Sinai desert for 40 years when they wandered were nomads. Nomads, by definition, their expertise is not to leave tracks behind, because you don't want people knowing where you are. And the Bedouin, if you know, the Bedouins are the best, what do they do in the army, Lauren?
Trackers.
They're the trackers, right? So they know how to track, they know how to not be tracked. So Bedouin, by definition, try not to leave behind evidence. Furthermore, what is the primary source of ancient archaeological findings? So later period, it started to be oil lamps. You know, in Israel, they found gazillion oil lamps. But generally, the most common is pottery. And you can go around Israel, go hiking, you'll find ancient pottery. It's 2,000 years old, it's 1,000 years old, 200 years old, 3,000. You know, I'm not expert enough to know. But there's so much of it, like, it's not even archaeological. I used to have a pot and I found it somewhere. I didn't know where it is anymore. You know, okay. So, by definition also, Bedouin, how are they carrying their liquids? Not in pots. They're carrying them in leather skins. In fact, the rabbis say that when the Moabites, the Ammonites, did not want to let the Jews through and didn't want to give them supplies, they gave them water skins full of air instead of water, and they were so famished they just like gulped it in and they gulped air into their stomachs. That's how they tried to sabotage them. So, by definition, they are not going to leave behind evidence of their passing. So that's what I would say. Okay. So, how long does it take to get from Egypt to Canaan?
A few years.
So I think in the beginning book of Deuteronomy it even says 11 days. 11-day journey. I did it when, I don't want to date myself too much, but when the border had opened between Egypt and Israel. You take a bus from Cairo to the Suez Canal. You take a boat across the Suez Canal. You take another bus from the canal to Tel Aviv. You leave Cairo in the morning, you're in Tel Aviv by the evening. So, you know, a day's journey with all these delays. 200 miles, You know, walk 10 miles a day, do a 200-300-mile journey, no problem. 11-day trip. How the heck did it take them 40 days? Right? So the cartoon is, you see Moses in the desert looking at the map, and the women are saying, you see, these men, they never ask for directions. But our understanding was that the generation that left Egypt was, as I said before, you know, you can take the Jew out of Egypt, but you can't take Egypt out of the Jew. So they were lacking of faith and trust, and there was a kind of decree placed upon them that that generation would not enter the land of Israel. So the whole generation that left Egypt, anyone over 20, when they left Egypt, perished in the desert, and they kept them in the desert long enough for a new generation to replenish itself. And it went from what the rabbis called the generation of the desert to the generation of knowledge, the enlightened generation. In other words, they weren't born slaves, so they could be in a position to enter the promised land. So Joshua, we all know the narrative, Moses does not merit to enter the land, right? He has to put up with these Jewish people for 40 years, and then he gets to see the land, but he doesn't get to enter the land. And in fact, Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr., the night before his assassination, quoted this story of, you know, I am standing on the edge of the promised land, and I look and I see it, but I'm not there. And maybe I won't be able to enter there, but our children and our children's children will surely find the promised land. And prophetically, the next day he was killed, which is unbelievable. He was quoting this vision of, you know, this narrative of Moshe, who led the people but never got to enter the land. So who brought the Jewish people into the land? And I have for you here the list of the, do we have it? Oh, I don't have it. Oh, the books of the Bible. Oh, I guess I don't have it. So Moses' disciple, Joshua, leads the people into the land. And so what the source for these stories, the 5 books of Moses go from the beginning of Genesis until Moses' last speech on the border of the land. And then that ends the 5 books of Moses, which we consider to be on a higher level of sanctity, because it's the 5 books of Moses. Then you have the books of the prophets, which come afterwards. And those are part of the Old Testament, Hebrew Bible, whatever you want to call it, what we call the Tanakh. Those are the books of the prophets, and then the books of the writings. So the first book of the prophets is the book of Joshua, which is the story of Moses' disciple bringing the people into the land. And he will bring the people into the land and start to divide up the land, which will be divided up into 12 tribes. Right? The 12 sons of Jacob each had families, and they had families, until they become full tribes, numbering in the tens of thousands of people. And they enter the land, and the land will be divided up. And for the next 450 years, they will be, in a sense, a loose alliance of Hebraic, of Israelite tribes. If you will, the United States before the Constitutional Convention, which was in 1798, yes? So the revolution was 1776, 13 years after the revolution. What happened between American Revolution and the Constitutional Convention? There was a very small federal government. There was no constitution. There was Declaration of Independence, but there was no constitution creating a uniform set of laws. There was no standing army. There was a president, but really, In other words, was there even a Congress before the Constitutional Convention? I don't think so.
I think there was the Articles of Confederation.
Was there? Okay. But in other words, there was no, so for the Israelites, there was no king, there was no capital of Jerusalem. In fact, the Ark, the center of religious worship, wasn't even in Jerusalem at the time. It was in several places, Shiloh and then Hebron. So this is a period of kind of a looser amalgamation of tribes who lived together, and spontaneously, when there was problems, they would have a leader who would arise, called the judges. Some of the most famous of the judges being Deborah, period of woman leadership of the Jewish people. Samson was also one of the judges. And they would kind of unite when there was a foreign threat, get their armies together, spontaneously one of these leaders would arise, lead them to battle, and then they'd all go back and lead their lives as separate tribes. So it's kind of like states without the federal government. So that's this period, the next period. And next week we will pick up with beginning the story of King David, which will begin a new period, the period of monarchy. So we had the period of the patriarchs and matriarchs, right? Abraham through the sons of Jacob. We had the period of slavery in Egypt and the beginning of a nationhood. We had the giving of the Torah, which created the covenant on a national level. We had the Jewish people wandering in the desert after that, and then entering the land, and then a period of loosely affiliated tribes in the land of Israel. So that's our story, the beginning of our story. And next week we'll talk about King David, the 10 lost tribes, and Babylon, and the Purim and Hanukkah story.